The woman who stepped off that train in February 1878 was not supposed to be alone. She was supposed to be a bride. Instead, the station master wouldn't meet her eyes when he told her. Wouldn't even take off his hat, just stood there in the brutal cold, breath fogging, boots shifting in the snow, and said it the way men out west said everything they didn't want to say, flat and quick and without apology. "Mr. Harlan Pruitt died 4 days ago, ma'am. Horse threw him on the ice road. Nobody knew how to reach you in time." Eliza Mercer stood on that platform with a cardboard trunk, $14, and a one-way ticket that had already been used. The wind came off the mountain and didn't care about any of it. She thought, "I have come 2,000 miles to bury a man I never met." If you have ever found yourself in a place you cannot leave, with no one who knows your name, stay with this story, because what happens next will change what you believe about second chances. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The train had been 3 days out of Boston when Eliza Mercer finally allowed herself to feel something close to hope. She'd spent the first day convincing herself she wasn't making a terrible mistake. The second day watching the landscape change through the window, the neat eastern towns giving way to something rawer, more honest, and wondering if raw and honest were things she could learn to live inside. By the third day, she had stopped arguing with herself and started listening to the rhythm of the wheels on the track, and it had almost sounded like something telling her forward, forward, forward. She was 29 years old. She had spent those years in a narrow house on a narrow street, keeping her father's accounts after her mother died and her 2 brothers married and moved away. Her father had been a decent man, not warm, not unkind, just deeply preoccupied. And when he died in November of 1877, Eliza had inherited the house, which turned out to be mortgaged to the ceiling, and a small savings that wouldn't stretch past March. She had 2 choices. She could find employment in Boston, which for a woman her age with no particular training meant domestic service or seamstress work, or she could answer one of the advertisements in the back pages of the newspaper. She had read those columns before, usually with a mixture of pity and judgment. Widow seeks companionship. Rancher desires educated wife for frontier homestead. Good Christian woman preferred. She answered 6 letters. Only one wrote back. Harlan Pruitt, age 44, of Running W Ranch, Cutbank County, Montana Territory. He had described himself in careful, deliberate sentences. He was not given to flourish, he said, but he believed in being straightforward. He owned 1,100 acres. He ran cattle. He needed a woman who could manage a household and keep books, and he was willing to provide a comfortable home in exchange. He did not promise romance. He did not promise happiness. He promised steadiness, which Eliza, having spent her life around the absence of it, found more appealing than she expected. They exchanged 4 letters over 6 weeks. By the end of the 4th, she had agreed to come. She told herself she was being practical. She told herself it was a business arrangement and she was a practical woman, and there was nothing shameful about 2 adults making a sensible decision. What she didn't tell herself, and what she only half admitted on the second day of the train ride, was that she was also tired. Tired of the narrow house and the narrow life, and the feeling of being useful to other people's futures while her own sat in a drawer like an unmailed letter. She arrived at Cutbank Station at 2:30 in the afternoon, and the cold hit her like a wall. She had brought her warmest coat, a dark wool traveling suit, and 2 pairs of gloves. None of it was enough. Montana in February was not merely cold. It was cold with intention, cold that found the gaps in everything you owned and settled there. She stepped off the train and looked up and down the platform and saw no one who looked like he was waiting for a bride. The station master was inside by the coal stove. He was a small man named Guthrie, with a red nose and the look of someone who had spent years delivering information he didn't want to deliver. He told her about Harlan Pruitt in 4 sentences. Horse threw him. Ice road. 4 days ago. No way to reach her in time. Eliza stood in front of him and did not move for a long moment. The coal stove popped and hissed. Outside the window, the afternoon light was already going thin and gray. "Is there anyone coming from the ranch?" she asked. "Couldn't say, ma'am. I sent word out this morning when I saw the passenger manifest, but it's a hard ride in this weather. Might be nobody comes tonight." "Is there a hotel?" He looked uncomfortable. "There's a boarding house. Mrs. Calloway runs it, but she's particular about—" She doesn't usually take single women without... He stopped himself. You'd have to speak with her yourself. Eliza picked up her trunk by one handle, realized she could not manage it alone, and set it back down. She looked at the station master. She looked at the stove. She looked at the window, where the sky was doing something ominous along the western edge. Could I sit here for a while, she said, while I think? Yes, ma'am, he said, long as you need. She sat on the bench nearest the stove and put her hands in her lap and looked at the floor and thought about how completely, absolutely, catastrophically she had miscalculated. She had $14. The ticket back to Boston, if she could even purchase one, would cost more than that. She had no family to wire for money. Her brothers had wives and children and mortgages of their own, and the thought of asking either of them for rescue was something she could not make herself consider. She had left Boston with what amounted to her entire life packed into a cardboard trunk, and the man who was supposed to be at the end of that journey was dead in the frozen ground. She sat there for an hour. The light faded. The station master kept glancing at her with increasing discomfort. The coal stove burned down to embers and he added another shovel, and the air in the small station smelled like iron and burning dust. At some point she realized she was shivering and hadn't noticed. She was still shivering when the door came open. He was tall. She registered that first, and covered in snow from his hat to his boots, which meant he had been riding hard and fast in weather that didn't encourage either. He stopped in the doorway and looked around the station, and his eyes landed on her, and something shifted in his expression, though she couldn't have said what. You Eliza Mercer? He said. Yes. He pulled off one glove and rubbed his face with his bare hand. He looked like a man who had been given bad news about something he already knew was bad. I'm Cole Rourke, foreman out at the Running W. I rode in as soon as we got Guthrie's message. He paused. I'm real sorry about Mr. Pruitt, ma'am. It was a senseless thing. Thank you, she said, because that was what you said. He looked at her more carefully then, in the way someone looks when they're trying to figure out how bad a situation actually is. She was sitting very straight, chin up, hands folded, and she could feel herself doing all the things she did when she was frightened, the stillness, the precision. And she wondered if it looked like composure or if it looked like what it actually was. You got somewhere to go tonight? He asked. The station master mentioned a boarding house. Cole glanced at Guthrie, and something passed between them that Eliza couldn't read. Mrs. Calloway's house is full up, Cole said. Freighter men came through 2 days ago, stuck on account of the roads. I see. It's going to drop to 15 below tonight, maybe lower. I see, she said again. He stood there for a moment. He had not removed his coat or his hat, which meant some part of him was still deciding whether this conversation was going to lead anywhere he wanted to go. She watched him think. He had a face that didn't hide much. Not because he was careless, but because he seemed like someone who had long ago stopped bothering with the performance of things. I can take you back to the ranch, he said finally. There's a spare room in the house. It wouldn't be... It's not a proper arrangement, and I know that, but there's nobody there who'd say otherwise. The boys bunk in the outbuilding. She looked at him. You'd freeze to death out here, he said, not unkindly, just honestly. Eliza thought about that. She thought about the $14 and the sold house and the dead man who had been her one plan. She thought about what her mother would have said about getting into a horse-drawn wagon with a strange man in a Montana blizzard. She thought about the floor and the cold and the feeling of the bench underneath her and how her feet had gone completely numb 20 minutes ago. All right, she said. He looked slightly surprised, like he had been bracing for an argument. Then he nodded. Let me see to the horse. I'll come back for your trunk. He went out and she stood up, and the blood rushing back into her feet hurt badly enough that she had to grip the bench for a moment. Guthrie watched her with something between pity and relief that the problem of her had been resolved. Cole came back in and took her trunk with one hand like it weighed nothing and jerked his head toward the door. She followed him out into the cold and the dark, and he didn't speak again until they were standing at the wagon, and he turned to her and said, Here, and took off the coat he was wearing and put it around her shoulders. She started to object. Don't, he said. I've got a wool underlayer, I'll manage. You get in. The coat was enormous on her, heavy and smelling of horse and cold air, and something woodsy she couldn't identify. She got in. He climbed up on the other side and clicked to the horse, and they moved out into the dark and the snow, and Eliza sat there wrapped in a stranger's coat and looked up at the sky. which out here, away from any city light, was full of more stars than she had ever seen in her life, and thought, I have no idea what happens now. The ranch was 40 minutes from town on a clear day. That night it took an hour and 20 minutes, and the wind picked up halfway through and the snow blew sideways across the road, and Cole had to lean forward and squint to keep the track. He didn't talk much. He asked her once if she was warm enough, and she said yes, which was not entirely true, but was true enough. He told her the horse's name was Chester, and that Chester had bad opinions about winter and expressed them constantly, and she laughed despite herself. And he glanced sideways at her like that surprised him too. The running W announced itself with lights before she could see the shape of it, squares of orange-yellow in the dark, a main house, and the outline of outbuildings. When they came into the yard, the dogs came out barking, and Cole said something short and quiet, and they subsided. He helped her down from the wagon and carried her trunk to the porch. Inside was not elegant, but it was warm. A cast-iron stove in the main room going full strength, plain furniture, walls with pegs for coats and harness. A table that had been used hard. It smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the particular closed-in smell of a house where people had spent a long winter. She stood in the middle of it and didn't move while Cole brought her trunk in behind her. "Kitchen's through there," he said. "There's food if you want it. The room at the end of the hall it was set up for—" He stopped. "It's got a good stove in it. I'll get it going." She understood. It had been set up for her arrival, for the bride. She didn't say anything about that. She followed him down the hall and watched him start the bedroom stove. And when he stood up and turned around, the room was already beginning to warm at the edges, and the firelight moved across the plain walls and the narrow bed and the single curtainless window. "I'll bring you some supper," he said. "I can manage. You've been on a train for 3 days and you nearly froze on that platform. Sit down, Miss Mercer." She sat down. He went to the kitchen. She heard him moving around, but the clank of a pot, the sound of the stove's iron door, and she took off her boots and set them neatly beside the door and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. She had been careful for so long. Careful not to hope too much, not to want too specifically, not to imagine a future with too much detail, because detail was how you got hurt. She had been practical and sensible, and she had made the most reasonable decision available to her, and it had still ended up here. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and made herself breathe. He came back with a plate of beans and salt pork and 2 thick slices of bread and a tin cup of coffee that was the best thing she had ever tasted in her life. He set it on the small table beside the bed and took a step back. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it." He was about to leave when she said, "Mr. Rourke." He stopped. "What happens now?" she said. "To me, I mean. To the ranch. What happens?" He was quiet for a moment. He leaned against the door frame and crossed his arms and looked at the floor like the answer might be written in the boards. "Pruitt didn't have a will, as far as I know. Or if he did, nobody's seen it. He had a cousin back east somewhere, maybe a nephew. Someone will come out eventually to deal with the property." He paused. "As for you, I don't rightly know, Miss Mercer. I don't want to tell you something that turns out to be wrong." "Tell me something true, then." He looked at her. She looked back. "True is," he said slowly, "that it's February, and there's no stage out of Cutbank for 3 weeks minimum on account of the roads, and you've got nowhere obvious to go. So for right now, you're here, and you're warm, and that's what matters tonight." She thought about arguing with the word tonight, with the implication that tomorrow was its own separate problem. But she was exhausted in a way that had gone past tiredness into something quieter and more total, and the food was in front of her and the room was warming and she was alive, which was more than could be said for the man whose bed she was not quite sitting in. "Thank you," she said again, "for coming. You didn't have to." "Yeah," he said, in a tone that didn't quite agree. Then he pushed off the doorframe and said goodnight and pulled the door mostly closed behind him. And Eliza Mercer sat alone in a dead man's ranch in the middle of a Montana winter and ate the beans and drank the coffee and tried to think clearly about her situation. She couldn't. She was too tired. So she set the plate aside and lay down on top of the quilt with her clothes still on and listened to the wind working at the corners of the house, and was asleep before she could form another thought. She woke at first light to the sound of boots on the porch. Through the single window she could see the sky going pale blue at the edge, which meant the storm had blown through overnight. The cold was still there. The stove had burned down. but the frantic quality had gone out of the wind. She sat up and her back ached from the train and the wagon and sleeping in her traveling clothes, and she put her feet on the floor and reached for her boots. By the time she found the kitchen, Cole was already there with two other men she hadn't met. Young, both of them, one red-headed and one with a jaw like a barn door. They stopped talking when she appeared in the doorway. "Morning," Cole said. "Miss Mercer, this is Pete Doyle and Frank Hurley. They work the ranch." Pete, the red-headed one, took his hat off quickly. Frank Hurley just stared. "Morning," Eliza said. "You want coffee?" Cole asked. "Please." She took the cup he poured and stood at the edge of the kitchen and felt three sets of male eyes navigating around her with the particular awkwardness of men who didn't know what category she fit into anymore. She had been the incoming bride, which had been one kind of thing. Now she was something else. Not a guest, not an employee, not family, and nobody had a protocol for it. She decided to make her own. "Who does the cooking here?" she asked. "Rotating," Cole said. "Usually Pete." She looked at the stove, which was a decent model, and the shelves, which had reasonable supplies. "I can cook breakfast," she said, "if someone will show me where things are." Frank Hurley blinked like she'd said something in a foreign language. "You don't have to," Cole started. "I'm aware," she said, "but I'd like to." Pete showed her where the flour was, and the lard, and the dried eggs. He did it with the shy helpfulness of someone who couldn't quite figure out the situation, but was willing to be pleasant in the meantime. She made biscuits because she knew how to make biscuits, and because useful work was the only thing that ever made her feel like herself again when everything else had gone sideways. The biscuits came out well. Frank Hurley ate 4 of them without speaking and then said, "Huh," in a tone that was almost admiring. After breakfast, Cole sent the 2 hands out to check on the cattle and stayed behind to wash up the plates, and Eliza stood at the window and looked out at the yard and the snow-covered hills beyond. "The ranch," she said. "Who runs it now, with Mr. Pruitt gone?" "I do, for the time being." He was at the basin, not looking at her. "I've been doing it in practice for 2 years anyway. Pruitt wasn't a hands-on man toward the end. His health was bad." She turned that over. "He didn't mention that." "No," Cole said. "I don't imagine he would." She thought about the 4 careful letters. The steady man who had promised a steady life. She wondered how much of the steadiness had been Cole Rourke, and how much had been a story that was easier to tell than the truth. "The accounts," she said. "Does someone maintain them?" He glanced over his shoulder. "Pruitt kept books. I can read them well enough to know where we stand, but I'm not—" He paused. "Accounting isn't my strength." "It's mine," she said. He turned all the way around then and looked at her with an expression she'd seen before. Not quite suspicion, not quite surprise, but that particular recalibration men did when a woman turned out to know something they hadn't expected. "I kept my father's accounts for 8 years, she said. "Small business, but it was real money and real books. I know what I'm doing." He didn't say anything for a moment. "You don't have to figure out what I am right now," she said. "I understand that. But if I'm going to be here for 3 weeks regardless, I'd like to be useful while I'm here. It's not in my nature to sit in a room and wait." Cole looked at her for a long few seconds. Then he said, "Books are in the study. I'll show you after breakfast clears up." She nodded and turned back to the window, and the cold light came in across the white yard, and she thought that useful was at least something. It was at least a start. The books were bad. Not catastrophically bad. Not the books of someone who had been stealing or lying outright. Just the books of a man who had been sick and distracted and leaning on a system that had worked once and slowly stopped working. There were columns that didn't reconcile, supply purchases logged against the wrong accounts, cattle tallies from 2 years back that nobody had updated. She spent the morning going through them in a straight-backed chair with a stub of pencil and a fresh sheet of paper, and by noon she had a rough picture of where the running W actually stood versus where someone reading the books casually might think it stood. The difference was not comfortable. She went to find Cole in the barn, where he was checking a fence post someone had brought in for repair. She stood in the barn door and waited for him to notice her, and when he looked up, she said, "Can we talk about the books?" "That fast?" He set down the post. "I've been doing this a long time," she said. "I can tell you what I see if you want to hear it." He came to where she was standing, brushing wood shavings off his hands, and she showed him the paper. She walked him through it without apology or softening. The supply debt that had been rolled forward twice without interest accounting, the cattle sale from the previous fall that had been recorded twice, the gap between what the payroll ledger said and what the monthly food purchases suggested. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. Most men interrupted. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He looked at the paper and not at her. "How bad?" he said. "Not ruinous," she said carefully, "but not what someone looking quickly would think. If there's a relative coming to assess the estate, what they see in the books won't be accurate." "In what direction?" "It'll look better than it is," she said, which sounds like good news, but it isn't. It means whoever inherits will make decisions based on wrong information. Cole looked out the barn door at the yard. His jaw was set in the particular way of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't like the outcome of. "I've put 6 years into this place," he said. It wasn't self-pity, just a fact, stated plainly. "I know," she said. Though she didn't know, not really. She was guessing at the shape of it from the way he stood when he talked about the ranch. He looked at her then. The winter light in the barn was gray and flat, and it made everything look very simple, stripped of ornament. "Would you be willing," he said slowly, "to go through all of it, make it accurate?" "Yes," she said. "That's why I'm telling you." He nodded. He went back to the fence post. She went back to the study, and the cold came in under the door, and she tucked her feet up on the chair rungs and kept working. 3 days passed. She fell into a routine that surprised her with how quickly it settled. Up before light, start the kitchen stove, make the coffee, start on the books while the men ate. She didn't make every meal. Pete and Frank had their own rhythms, and she didn't want to displace them. But she cooked every other day and kept the house accounts separate from the ranch accounts, and by the end of the 3rd day she had the entire ledger reconciled and annotated in a hand that was clear and precise and left no room for misreading. She showed Cole on the 4th evening. He sat at the kitchen table with the ledger, and she sat across from him with her notes, and she walked him through every correction. He asked good questions, practical, specific, and she answered them, and they were so focused on the problem in front of them that an hour passed before either of them noticed. This is real work," he said, turning one of the pages. "Yes. You're good at it." "I know I am," she said, not unkindly. He looked up. Something crossed his face. Amusement, maybe, or respect, or some combination of the two that hadn't settled into a clear category yet. Most people don't say that about themselves. Most people were raised to pretend otherwise. "I don't have the patience for it." He almost smiled. Almost. Frank Hurley came in from outside then, tracking snow, and stopped when he saw them both at the table with the ledger spread between them, and then backed out quietly in a way that Eliza pretended not to notice. Cole closed the ledger. He had a habit of pressing his hand flat over the cover when he closed it, like making a decision. "I'd like to offer you a position," he said. "Household manager and ranch bookkeeper. Proper wage. Room and board. For as long as you want it, or until the heir comes and changes everything." Eliza looked at the ledger. She looked at the window, which had gone dark while they talked, and the reflection of the lamp in it. "All right," she said. "All right?" "Yes," she said. "All right." He nodded. He started to say something else and then stopped himself. He pushed his chair back and took his coat from the peg and went to the door, and when he had one hand on the latch, he turned back. "You're not what I expected," he said, "when I rode in to get you." "What did you expect?" she asked. He thought about it. "Someone who needed saving," he said. Then he went out into the cold and closed the door behind him, and Eliza sat at the kitchen table alone in the lamplight and felt something she hadn't felt since she left Boston, something that was careful and fragile and very nearly hope. She did not let herself call it that yet. She had made that mistake before, but she didn't stop it either. The position Cole offered her didn't come with a title or a contract, just a handshake across the kitchen table and the understanding that both of them would hold up their end. Eliza was not naive enough to think that settled anything permanently. She knew what she was. A woman alone in a dead man's house, employed by a man who had no legal authority to employ her on a ranch that belonged to whoever a court decided it belonged to. She knew it could all collapse in a week. But she had $14 and no road home and a ledger that needed her, so she took the handshake and the room and went back to work. The Cowboys were the first problem. Not Cole. Cole had made his assessment and moved on, which was the most efficient thing about him. But Pete Doyle and Frank Hurley had their own opinions about Eliza Mercer, and they expressed them the way ranch hands usually expressed opinions they didn't want to say directly, by doing everything slightly wrong in her presence and waiting to see what she did about it. Pete left muddy boots inside the door 3 mornings in a row. Frank came to breakfast without washing his hands, which she could see clearly were coated in axle grease, and when she set the pan on the table, he reached in with both of them, and she said, without looking at him, "The basin's on the porch." He looked at her. "The water's not frozen," she said. "I checked." He went. Pete watched him go and then looked at Eliza, and she turned back to the stove and didn't say anything else. And when Frank came back and they all sat down to eat, there was a quality of silence at the table that was not hostile so much as waiting. She understood it. She had lived her whole life in rooms full of people who were waiting to find out what she actually was. She was used to letting the question sit until the answer made itself known. The answer, in this case, was the horses. There were 9 horses at the Running W, 7 working horses, 1 aging mare that Frank had a particular attachment to, and Cole's own animal, a dark bay called Nero, that was significant in the way of horses that know they're significant. Eliza had ridden a little in Massachusetts, nothing serious, nothing that prepared her for Montana terrain. But she asked Cole, at the end of the first week, if someone could show her. He looked skeptical. "Show you what exactly?" "How to ride out here. Properly. Not the way I learned in Boston." He considered this. "Why?" "Because I can't manage this household without knowing the land," she said. "And I can't know the land from the kitchen window." He thought about it the way he thought about most things. Not long, but completely. "I'll take you out Saturday," he said. Saturday was February 22nd, and the temperature was 8 degrees above zero, which by Montana standards meant it was practically hospitable. Cole saddled a steady gray mare named Agnes for her and watched Eliza approach the horse with the focused expression of someone determined not to embarrass herself. She got in the saddle wrong the first time. He didn't say anything, just waited while she righted herself, and then told her 3 things. How to hold the reins, how to use her knees, how to tell Agnes she meant it when she gave a direction. He said them once, not twice. She appreciated that. She hated being talked to like she was slow. They went out for 2 hours across the north pasture and along the creek line, which was frozen into a white shelf of ice. He pointed out where the fence line ran, where the cattle wintered, what the land looked like in sections, and why each section mattered to the operation. He talked about the ranch the way men talked about things they loved when they thought they weren't admitting to love. Technical, precise, with detail that went a little past what was strictly necessary. She fell off once, caught a patch of ice on a slope, and Agnes slid and Eliza went sideways into the snow with a noise that was not elegant. She lay in the snow for a moment looking at the sky, which was the particular blue of Montana in winter, hard and clean and very far away, and then she sat up. Cole was beside her, or he'd come off his horse faster than seemed possible for a man his size. He was crouched in the snow, one hand out. "I'm fine," she said before he could ask. "You sure?" "My pride is injured. That's the worst of it." She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. He didn't make a face about it. He just kept hold of her hand for 1 extra second, steadying, and then let go. They rode back without discussing it, but something had shifted, small and difficult to name. Some quality of the distance between them had changed, the way air changed before a change in weather. Pete and Frank noticed. She saw it in the way they watched Cole when Eliza came into a room, the way they'd exchanged looks that were male and opaque and annoying. She decided to ignore it, which was the right call. What she could not ignore was the conversation she overheard on the morning of the second week. She was on the porch, having gone out to bring in the flour sack she'd left there to cool, and Pete and Frank were in the yard near the water trough, which was on the other side of the porch wall. They didn't know she was there. "Don't see how she lasts," Frank was saying. "Place goes to the cousin, or whoever. They're not keeping a Boston bookkeeper on wages." "Cole seems to think she's useful," Pete said. "Cole thinks a lot of things." A pause. "She did fix the books. I heard him say the numbers were off by—" "She's not a rancher," Frank said. "She's going to get cold and tired and go back east, and Cole's going to be left looking foolish for banking on her." Eliza stood on the porch with the flour sack and listened to this and felt the specific cold anger of a person being discussed as if they were a weather event. Something to be endured or waited out, not engaged with. She had felt it before. She had felt it her whole life, in one form or another. She went inside and put the flower away. That afternoon, she asked Pete to teach her to saddle a horse herself. He blinked at her. "You want to?" "I don't want to need someone every time," she said. "Show me." He showed her. It took her 3 tries to get the cinch right, and he corrected her without condescension, which revised her opinion of him slightly upward. She practiced until she could do it in under 4 minutes. Then she asked him about the feeding schedule for the horses, the particular feed ratios for the working animals versus the mare, and he answered her with increasing respect because she asked smart questions and didn't ask the same one twice. By the end of the 2nd week, she could saddle her own horse. She knew the pasture layout well enough to navigate it without Cole, and she had started keeping a second set of notes alongside the main ledger, observations about the ranch's operation, inefficiencies she noticed, patterns in the supply purchases that didn't match the season's demands. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was trying to understand the things she'd agreed to help manage. But when she set the notes on the kitchen table one evening and Cole came in and saw them, he picked them up and stood there reading for a long time. "You noticed the winter hay orders," he said. 3 years in a row, the same amount ordered, regardless of how bad the winter is or how many cattle we're carrying. But the winter varies and the herd size varies. The order doesn't. Pruitt always said one number was easier to account for. One number is also wasteful in a mild winter and insufficient in a bad one. You're either feeding them too much or not enough. Cole set the notes down. He had the look he got when he was thinking hard about something and trying not to show it. "How would you do it?" She told him. She had been working it out for 3 days, a variable order system based on the previous year's grass assessment and the cattle count, with a reserve margin built in for a hard winter. It wasn't complicated. It was just the kind of thinking that required time and attention that a sick man running a failing operation didn't have. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. "Can you write that out?" he said, "in case whoever comes out to settle the estate asks about the management approach." "Already done," she said, and handed him the 2nd page of her notes. He looked at it. He looked at her. He said nothing, and somehow the nothing said more than most things. Frank Hurley came in for supper that night and saw Eliza's notes spread across the table, and Cole sitting there reading them with the expression he reserved for things that mattered. And Frank didn't make a sound about it. He just sat down and ate his supper. She let herself feel it, just briefly, just for a moment, the small, solid satisfaction of having been doubted and having been right. Then she put her plate in the basin and went back to the ledger, because satisfaction wasn't the same as security, and she was very clear about that difference. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in early March, when the cold was finally showing its first hesitation. The station master sent it out with a supply rider, a thick envelope addressed to the estate of Harlan Pruitt, Isquos, from a law office in St. Paul, Minnesota. Cole brought it to Eliza without opening it because she'd been handling the estate paperwork, and she opened it at the kitchen table while he stood by the stove. She read it twice. Then she set it down. "There's an heir," she said. "Nephew. Gideon Wilson, St. Paul. He's coming out to assess the property and determine whether to sell." Cole said nothing. He turned and looked at the window. "The letter says he expects to arrive within 6 weeks," she continued. "He'll be accompanied by a man from the law office." 6 weeks, Cole said. Not a question, just the weight of it. "It also says—" She paused. She read the relevant passage again to make sure she had it right. "It says that any existing arrangements regarding staff or employment are considered temporary pending the heir's review, and all contracts are contingent on his decision." Cole turned back from the window. He had the look of a man absorbing a hit he knew was coming, but that still landed hard. "That's the ranch's death warrant if he decides to sell." "Not necessarily." She pulled her notes toward her. "If he sees the corrected books, the management plan, the development I've outlined for the spring operations, he doesn't know me," Cole said. "He doesn't know this land. He's a man from a city looking at land he didn't work for. To him, it's numbers on a paper." "Then we make the numbers tell the right story," Eliza said, "which is what I've been doing for the past 3 weeks. He looked at her steadily. "You don't have a stake in this." "I have a position in it," she said. "That's enough." It wasn't the whole truth. She knew it wasn't the whole truth. Her stake had been growing quietly, incrementally, the same way affection grows when you're not paying attention. in small exchanges and shared meals and the specific silence of working alongside someone who understood what work was. She wasn't ready to call it anything, and she wasn't going to, but it was there, and it made the letter sitting on the table feel like more than just a legal problem. She didn't say any of that. She picked up her pen. "Let me write a summary of the operational state of the running W," she said. "Something a city man can read in 20 minutes and understand. You tell me if I get anything wrong about the land or the cattle." Cole was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He folded his hands on the table. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you're thinking." They worked until midnight. Pete put his head in at 9 and saw them at the table with papers spread in every direction and backed out without disturbing them, which Eliza noted with mild approval. Frank had long since gone to bed. The coal stove burned low, and Cole got up twice to add fuel without being asked. And Eliza wrote and rewrote and read sections aloud, and he corrected the things she had wrong: the names of the grazing sections, the history of the water rights, the weight averages on the cattle. And she wrote them in, and the document grew into something real. By the time they stopped, it was 11 pages in her careful hand, and she read it back to him from the beginning. And he sat with his arms on the table and listened with the expression of a man hearing his own history from someone else's mouth. "That's the ranch," he said when she finished. "Yes," she said. "You wrote it better than I could have." "You know it better than I do. I just arranged the words." He shook his head slightly, like he was disagreeing with something she hadn't quite said. The days after the letter had a different quality to them. A deadline does something to time. It makes ordinary moments heavier, more intentional. Eliza noticed it in herself and in Cole, in the way he'd sometimes stop in the middle of a task and look at the land around him with the expression of a man making a private accounting. She noticed it when he came to find her after the afternoon ride, still cold from outside, to ask about some detail of the supply analysis, standing in the doorway of the study with snow melting on his hat brim, and neither of them in any particular hurry to end the conversation. She noticed it on a Friday evening when the weather broke properly for the first time, and the temperature climbed to 30 degrees, and it felt, by comparison, like a spring afternoon. Pete and Frank had gone to town for supplies, and she and Cole were alone in the house, which had happened before, but felt different now in some way she didn't examine too directly. She had made soup, real soup, not the salt pork and beans that had been the ranch staple, and Cole had come in and smelled it and said, "What is that?" in a tone that suggested genuine wonder. "Chicken and barley," she said. "I found a dried hen in the cellar that nobody had gotten to. Don't ask how long it had been there." He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh with full sound, and it startled her. He had a good laugh, unguarded, quick, nothing like the man he usually presented. They ate at the kitchen table and talked. Not about the ranch, not about Gideon Wilson's letter or the operational summary. They talked about other things. He told her about growing up in Oregon and a father who ran horses, and how he'd come east to Montana at 19 because he'd heard there was land. She told him about Boston, about her father's accounting business, and her mother's roses, and the two brothers who were good men in the way of men who had moved on and stopped looking back. She told him about answering the letters and what she'd been thinking when she wrote back to Harlan Pruitt, and he listened without the awkward sympathy she'd expected. "You made a calculated decision," he said. "I thought I was being practical." "You were," he said. "It just didn't go the way you calculated." She turned her spoon in the bowl. "No, it didn't." "You're not sorry you came, though," he said. It wasn't exactly a question. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the direct quality he had. Not aggressive, just attentive, the kind of attention that was hard to deflect. "No," she said carefully. "Not sorry. Scared sometimes, but not sorry." He nodded, like that confirmed something he'd been working out. "What about you?" she said. "Is this what you wanted? When you came to Montana at 19. He thought about it, which was what she liked about him. He didn't answer before he'd thought. "I wanted land," he said. "My own. Not to work someone else's. I still want that." A pause. "What it looks like keeps changing." She understood that more than she expected. They were quiet for a moment, the comfortable kind, with the stove doing its work and the soup cooling and the dark outside the window deep and still. "The summary you wrote," Cole said. "I've been thinking about it." "What about it?" "The breeding section. What you said about the bloodline record. Pruitt never kept properly. She had suggested maintaining a breeding record, organized, consistent, something that would let them track the quality of the cattle over years, rather than guessing at it each season. It was basic animal husbandry applied to proper record keeping. What about it? If we did it right, Cole said, from this spring forward, not just cattle, but horses too. In 5 years, that record would be worth more than the land to the right buyer. It would show what the operation produces, not just what it owns. She looked at him. That's exactly what I was thinking. I know, he said. I could tell. She should not have felt as pleased by that as she did. She told herself it was professional satisfaction, which was partly true. She pressed her lips together and reached for her water glass, and Cole looked into his soup bowl, and neither of them said anything about whatever it was they'd just said. The third week brought trouble of a different kind. A man came to the ranch on a Tuesday, not from town, not expected, riding a good horse and wearing a city coat that did not belong in Montana. He tied the horse in the yard and walked to the door and knocked, with the authority of someone who didn't knock often and expected it to work the first time. Eliza answered the door because she was the one nearest to it. He was perhaps 50, with a wide face and small eyes and the kind of groomed mustache that announced opinions about the world. He looked at her and did not adjust his expression in the way of a man encountering unexpected information. I'm looking for the foreman, he said. He's in the south barn, she said. Who are you? Clement Walsh. He said it like she should know the name. Walsh Land and Cattle. I have an interest in this property. Eliza stood in the doorway. She did not step aside. Do you have an appointment? He blinked. He had clearly not anticipated the concept of an appointment applying to him. I have an interest, he said again, as if she'd missed it the first time. Mr. Rourke is in the south barn, she said. I'll let him know you're here. You're welcome to wait in the yard. She closed the door, not slammed, closed, firmly, with precision. She went out the back and around to the south barn and found Cole with Frank sorting equipment. She told him quickly, quietly, city coat, Walsh Land and Cattle, uninvited. Cole's jaw did the thing it did. He told Frank to stay put and came with her. Walsh was still in the yard, which he hadn't expected. He'd expected to be inside. Cole introduced himself and shook the man's hand in the neutral way he shook hands with everyone and asked what he could do for him. Walsh explained. He'd heard about Pruitt's death. He had existing business relationships in the county. He was interested in the property. He'd like to know if the heir had made a decision yet. The heir is coming out to review the situation himself, Cole said. No decisions made yet. Walsh looked at the house. He looked at Eliza, who was standing slightly to Cole's left with her arms at her sides. And this is ranch manager, Cole said. Miss Mercer handles the household and accounts. Walsh's small eyes moved over Eliza in the assessing way of a man pricing things. Interesting arrangement, he said. He pulled a card from his coat. When the heir arrives, I'd appreciate an introduction. I can offer a fair price. A better price than he'd get from anyone else in this country. Cole took the card. I'll let him know your interest. Walsh looked one more time at the house and the yard and the hills in the distance, and his expression was the expression of someone calculating ownership, and Eliza felt something cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. He wrote out. Cole looked down at the card. Walsh Land and Cattle, he said. He wants to buy. He wants to buy everything in this county before anyone knows what it's worth. He put the card in his pocket. He's offered on 3 other places I know of in the past 2 years. Got 2 of them. For fair prices? Cole's silence was its own answer. She looked at the road where Walsh had ridden out. Then the summary we wrote, she said. Gideon Wilson needs to see it before Walsh gets to him. If Walsh gets to him. He will, she said. Men like that find out when stages arrive. Cole looked at her sidelong. You know men like that? My father's business, she said. There were men like that in Boston. Different coat, same eyes. He turned this over. Then he said, we need to make sure the ranch looks like what it is before someone tells him what it isn't. It was the most they had agreed on about anything, stated plainly between them in the cold yard with Walsh's hoofprints still fresh in the snow. She spent the next 3 days updating the summary with the breeding record proposal, the supply efficiency plan, and a 5-year projection that was conservative but credible. Cole reviewed every page. He corrected 2 of her cattle numbers and confirmed everything else. Pete came in one evening and saw the papers, and without being asked, contributed the knowledge that the North Creek had a better flow than the books showed, which Eliza added as a note about water resources. Frank Hurley brought her coffee one morning without being asked and set it down beside her without saying anything and went back to whatever he'd been doing, and she understood that to be his version of capitulation. She was not the Eastern woman who couldn't survive. She was not going to pack up and go back. She was here and she was working and she knew what she was doing, and the men who lived here with her had made their peace with it one by one in the ways men made peace. Quietly, through action, without discussion. It wasn't warmth, not exactly, but it was something. Cole rode out to check the south fence line on a Thursday and didn't come back until after dark. She had held supper, which she told herself was practical and not anything else. When he came in, his hands were stiff from the cold, and he sat at the table and she set the plate in front of him and went back to her work at the other end of the table, and he ate in silence for a while. And then he said, "The south fence needs repair. Full section. That's 2 weeks of work in this weather." "Does it affect the spring grazing plan?" "Not if we get to it before the melt." He paused. "That's a big if." "Then we put it in the operational notes," she said. "It's an honest picture of the ranch, Cole. The good and the bad." He looked up at her use of his first name, which had happened gradually over the weeks without either of them marking the moment. She had stopped calling him Mr. Rourke somewhere around the second week, and he had stopped calling her Miss Mercer around the same time, and neither of them had acknowledged it. "You think Wilson will respect honesty," he said. "I think he'll respect precision," she said. "Honesty and precision aren't the same thing. Honesty means telling the whole story. Precision means telling it in a way he can understand what it's worth." Cole sat back in his chair and looked at her across the table with the particular attention that did something uncomfortable to her composure, and she kept her eyes on the paper. "Eliza," he said. She looked up. "When Wilson comes—" He stopped. He pressed his hand flat on the table the way he did when he was choosing words carefully. "Whatever he decides, you know you've made this place better, even if it all goes to Walsh in the end. You made it better." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp between them made the light warm and close. "So did you," she said. "For 6 years." He nodded. He looked at his plate. He picked up his fork again. She went back to her writing. Outside, the Montana dark pressed against the windows, wide and permanent and full of stars that didn't care about deeds of ownership or letters from St. Paul or men with small eyes and city coats. She wrote until her hand ached, and then she set the pen down and looked at what she had made. 11 pages, now 17, a document that told the truth about a piece of land and what it could be, and felt the steady, particular satisfaction of work that was real. She did not know yet what Gideon Wilson would make of it. She did not know what Walsh would offer or what a St. Paul lawyer would advise. She did not know what came next, but she knew the ranch now. She knew its debts and its strengths and its south fence problem and its water rights and the way the light came off the north pasture in the late afternoon when the snow was still clean. She knew it the way you knew something you had spent real time with. That, she told herself, was not nothing. That, she was beginning to understand, was quite a lot. Gideon Wilson arrived on a Tuesday, which Eliza thought was appropriate. Tuesdays had no particular dignity to them, no ceremony. They were just the day after the beginning, when the week had already settled into its shape and nothing felt new anymore. She saw him from the study window. He came in a hired buggy from town, which told her he hadn't ridden out himself, and he was accompanied by a man in a dark coat who could only be the lawyer. Gideon himself was younger than she expected, mid-30s at most, with a neat dark suit and a hat that had not been purchased in Montana. He stepped down from the buggy and stood in the yard and looked at the house with the expression of a man trying to calculate something. Cole was already in the yard to meet him. She watched Cole shake his hand, the same neutral handshake, and say something she couldn't hear through the glass. The lawyer shook hands too, and then all three of them looked at the house, and Eliza moved back from the window. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. It was not because she was nervous, she told herself. It was because men who had traveled from St. Paul wanted coffee, and she was the person who made coffee in this house. She was still telling herself this when Cole brought them through the front door. "Miss Mercer," Cole said. "This is Gideon Wilson and Mr. Reed from Ashford and Reed in St. Paul." She turned from the stove and looked at Gideon Wilson directly, the way she had learned to look at people whose opinions were going to matter. He had a pleasant enough face, not hard, not calculating, just the careful face of a man who had been told things about this place and was now revising them against reality. His eyes went to her and registered something, though she couldn't tell what. "Mr. Wilson," she said. "Mr. Reed, I've got coffee coming. Please sit." Reed, the lawyer, took out a small notebook before he sat down, which told her everything about his priorities. They made the first half hour manageable. Cole talked about the operation, the cattle count, the spring outlook, the fence repair they'd started on the south line. Gideon asked questions that were not stupid questions, which she noted. He asked about the water rights, about the relationship with neighboring ranches, about the year-over-year cattle figures. Cole answered precisely because she had spent 3 weeks making sure he could. Reed wrote things in his notebook. When there was a pause, Eliza set the folder on the table. "Mr. Wilson," she said, "I've prepared a summary of the ranch's current financial position and operational capacity. Corrected figures from the existing ledger, along with a 5-year projection and 2 management proposals for your consideration. I'd recommend reading it before you tour the property." Gideon looked at the folder. He looked at her. "You prepared this?" "I did. I manage the accounts." Reed looked up from his notebook. "You're the housekeeper." "I manage the household and the accounts," she said pleasantly. "Both require the same skill set in my experience, knowing where things are and what they cost." Reed did not look charmed. Gideon picked up the folder. He read for 20 minutes at the kitchen table while Cole sat across from him and Reed wrote things in his notebook and Eliza refilled coffee cups. She had learned, in her father's business, that the worst thing you could do while someone read your work was hover. She moved around the kitchen with the deliberate calm of someone who had already done everything she could do and was now simply waiting for the world to respond. She heard the page turn. Then another. Then he went back to a previous page, which was either a good sign or a bad sign, and she couldn't tell which. "The breeding record proposal," Gideon said. He wasn't looking up. "Whose idea was this?" "Mine," Eliza said. He turned another page. "And the supply variance analysis." "Also mine." Now he looked up. He had the expression of a man revising a prior calculation. "Mr. Rourke said in his letter that he had a ranch manager. He didn't say—" He stopped, apparently deciding not to finish the sentence. "He didn't say she was a woman," Eliza said. "No, he wouldn't have mentioned it because it isn't relevant to the quality of the work." Reed made a sound that might have been skepticism or might have been a cleared throat. She decided to treat it as the latter. "The numbers in this summary," Gideon said, tapping the second page, "they're different from what Pruitt's estate ledger shows." "Yes, because the estate ledger had errors. I corrected them." She came to the table and turned to the third page of the document. "Here, I've listed each correction with the original entry and the corrected figure alongside it. If you want to trace any of them back to the source documents, they're all in the study." He looked at the correction log for a long moment. Reed leaned over to look too, and she saw him comparing figures in his head, and his mouth did something small and reluctant. "These are significant discrepancies," Reed said. "Yes," Eliza said. "That's why I wrote them down." Cole had been sitting very still the entire time, with his hands on the table, not saying anything. She understood what that stillness cost him. This was a man who had spent 6 years building something that was now being sorted through by strangers, and he was holding himself so carefully that the table might as well have been a fence rail he was gripping. "Could I see the original ledger?" Gideon said. "Of course." She went to the study and brought it back. She set it on the table and Gideon and Reed both leaned over it together, and she stood at the edge of the table with her hands folded and let them look. 10 minutes passed. Cole refilled his own coffee cup, which was the most restless thing she'd seen him do. "These errors," Gideon said finally, "they were in Pruitt's own hand." "Yes." "So he made them, not someone else." "As far as I can tell. Some of it was illness. The handwriting changes toward the later entries. Some of it was a system that had stopped being maintained properly. I don't think it was deliberate." Gideon sat back. He had a quality she hadn't expected from a city man. He listened to information without immediately turning it into a decision. He let it settle first. She respected that. "Walk me through the 5-year projection," he said. She walked him through it. She went page by page, every assumption stated plainly, every figure sourced. Cole filled in the land-specific details when she asked him. He knew exactly when to speak and what to say, and she thought, not for the first time, that they had learned to work together in the way of people who had been doing it much longer than 3 weeks. Gideon asked careful questions throughout. Reed wrote everything in his notebook. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. "You've put considerable work into this," Gideon said. "The ranch warranted it," she said. He looked at her, a longer look than before, the kind that was trying to understand something. "You came out here to marry my uncle," he said. It was not unkind, just direct. "Yes. And instead you ended up running his books. Among other things. You could have gone back to Boston." "The road was closed," she said, "and then it opened, and I had work to do, so I stayed." Gideon made a small sound that might have been a laugh. He looked at Cole. "She always like this?" "Yes," Cole said, without hesitation. Gideon looked at the document again. He turned to the last page and read the breeding record proposal from the beginning. The room was quiet except for the stove and a horse in the yard who had opinions about something. Then he closed the folder and put both hands flat on it and said, "I need to see the land." Coley took him out the next morning, Gideon on a borrowed horse from the ranch, Reed choosing to stay at the house with his notebook, which Eliza thought was the most useful decision he'd made. She wrote out too, on Agnes, without asking whether she was invited, and neither Cole nor Gideon suggested she wasn't. It was the 3rd week of March. The cold was still real, but the quality of the light had changed, longer now, with an angle that was almost promising. The snow was pulling back from the south-facing slopes, and the grass underneath was pressed flat and yellow and waiting. Cole wrote it and named things as they came to them. The grazing sections, the creek, the north pasture where the cattle would move in April, the fence line they'd repaired. He spoke about the land the way she'd heard him speak about it only in private, with a precision that came from knowing something so long it had become part of your own thinking. Gideon rode alongside and listened. He asked about the neighboring property to the east, who owned it, what the relationship was. Cole told him. A family called Sutton, good neighbors. They shared a fence line and kept the arrangement honest. Gideon asked about water rights in the summer months. Cole explained the creek situation, the spring that fed it from the north, the years when the creek ran low, and what they did about it. At one point they stopped on a rise and looked out over the full sweep of the north pasture, and Eliza watched Gideon's face while he looked at it. She saw something happen there, not a decision, but something before a decision, the moment when a person stopped processing data and started feeling the weight of a thing. "My uncle never described it like this," Gideon said. "What did he describe it as?" Cole asked. "An investment." A pause. "He talked about cattle prices and acreage. He never said—" He stopped. "He never said it looked like this." Cole didn't say anything. Eliza didn't either. Some things were better left to land itself. They rode back in the late afternoon, and Gideon was quieter than he'd been on the way out. That evening, Walsh came. Eliza heard the horse in the yard and looked out the window and recognized the good horse and the city coat and felt something tighten in her chest. Cole was still washing up from the ride. She went to the door herself. Walsh smiled at her. It was a smile that had learned the shapes of warmth without the feeling behind them. "Miss Mercer, is Mr. Wilson available?" "He's resting from his ride," she said. "I won't take long." She held the door without opening it wider. "Mr. Wilson hasn't made any decisions yet. He's still reviewing the situation." "Of course." Walsh reached into his coat pocket. "I've taken the liberty of preparing an offer. It's a strong number. I think you'll find it very— Mr. Walsh." She kept her voice pleasant. "I'll let Mr. Wilson know you came by. He'll reach out if he's interested in speaking with you." Walsh's smile didn't move. He was the kind of man whose smile was structural. It didn't mean anything by being there. "It's a generous offer," he said. "The land market right now—" "I understand you have an interest in the property," she said. "So does Mr. Wilson's foreman and Mr. Wilson himself. I'll pass along that you came by." She closed the door. Not slammed, closed. She stood in the hall for a moment and breathed. Then she went to find Cole, who was coming out of the back bedroom, and she said, "Walsh is here." Cole went still for 1 second. "I'll go out." "I already sent him off." But he had an offer in his pocket. Cole's jaw did the thing. "How much?" He didn't say. He wanted to give it to Gideon directly. They stood in the hall and looked at each other, and she could see Cole working through the problem. If Walsh gets to Gideon before we make our case fully, then we make our case tonight, she said. She went and knocked on the door of the room where they'd put Gideon, and he called to come in, and she opened the door. He was sitting at the small desk with his jacket off, looking at her document with a pencil in his hand, and she felt a specific kind of relief at the sight of the pencil. A man who was annotating a thing was a man who was thinking about it, not dismissing it. Clement Walsh just came by, she said. He has an offer for the property. He'll try to reach you directly. Gideon set the pencil down. I'm aware of Walsh land and cattle. He's bought 2 other ranches in this county in the past 2 years. I don't know what he paid, but Cole says it wasn't fair market. What is fair market for a place like this? Gideon asked. It was a genuine question, not a challenge. What it could produce over 20 years under competent management, she said. Not what someone is willing to pay for it today. He looked at her steadily. You have an opinion on whether I should sell. I have an analysis, she said. The opinion is yours to form. He almost smiled. You're careful with words. When they matter, yes. He picked up the pencil again. Is there anything in this document about what the ranch would need to reach these projections, specifically in terms of management? Page 12, she said. Management structure proposal. It requires someone who knows the land operationally to have decision-making authority. That's Cole. And you? I'm in it as well, yes. He nodded. He turned to page 12. She went back to the kitchen. Cole was there. He looked up when she came in. She said, he was reading it with a pencil. Cole was quiet for a moment. That mean what I think it means? I don't know yet. But it's better than not reading it. He nodded. He stood there with his hands at his sides in the kitchen and the lamp burning between them and the full weight of 6 years sitting somewhere behind his eyes. She wanted to say something that would help and didn't know what it was, so she said nothing, which was sometimes better. The meeting that night was not planned. It simply happened the way consequential conversations happen, gradually, and then all at once. Reed went to bed at 9. Pete and Frank were in the bunkhouse, and Gideon came to the kitchen at 9:30 with the document in his hand and sat down and said, Tell me about Clement Walsh. Cole told him. He was specific and honest. Walsh's history in the county, the 2 ranches he'd bought, the way the prices had been structured, the condition those operations were in now under his management. Walsh ran cattle on volume, not quality. He overgrazed and moved on. He was not a man who built things. Gideon listened. He looked at the table. He'll offer you more than you expect, Cole said. He always does with the first number, because he knows the second number, what it's worth once he's worked it. And even the first number is well below that. You know a lot about his business model, Gideon said. I've watched it for 2 years, and I've talked to men who took his first offer and spent the next 3 years being sorry about it. Gideon turned the document over in his hands. My uncle never operated this ranch at the level this document describes. No, Cole said. He was sick for longer than people knew. And before that, He paused, choosing something. He was not a detail man. But the land could support it. The land absolutely could. Cole said it without any performance, just flat conviction. The Running W has the water, the grazing capacity, the position. What it's needed was management that kept up with it. Gideon looked at Eliza. And the person who could do the accounting and the organizational structure for that. She met his eyes. Yes. He was quiet for a long time. The stove ticked. Outside, the Montana night was full of the sound of snowmelt running somewhere, the first real sound of the season changing. My father's business is in St. Paul, Gideon said finally. I have no interest in relocating to Montana territory. He paused. But I have considerable interest in not making a decision in the next 48 hours that I'll spend 20 years regretting. Neither Cole nor Eliza said anything. The partnership structure on page 12, Gideon said. Explain how that would function. Cole leaned forward. He and Eliza had drafted the partnership section together at midnight, 3 days before Gideon arrived, and it showed the care of 2 people who had talked through a thing from every angle. Cole walked Gideon through it, the equity arrangement, the management responsibilities, the profit structure. The mechanism by which the ranch could be sold at genuine market value in 10 years if Gideon chose to exit his interest. Eliza filled in the accounting and documentation specifics when Cole paused. Gideon asked 14 questions. She counted because counting was what she did when she was anxious and trying not to show it. They answered 13 of them fully and said honestly they didn't know the answer to the 14th, which was about a particular aspect of Montana Territory inheritance law, and Reed would need to look it up. When the questions stopped, Gideon looked at them both for a long moment. "I need to speak with Walsh," he said. Cole's expression didn't change, but Eliza felt the word land in the room. "That's your right," Cole said. "I want to hear his offer. Not because I've decided to accept it." He looked at Cole directly. "But because in any decision of this size, I believe in knowing all the numbers before I choose which one to take." Cole nodded slowly. "I'm going to ride out tomorrow morning," Gideon said. "Alone. I want to see the land without anyone talking about it." "Take the gray mare," Cole said. "Agnes. She's steady, and she knows the property." Gideon looked slightly surprised by the practicality of this. "All right." He stood up. He had the document under his arm. "Whatever I decide," he said, "this," he held up the folder. "This is the most complete picture of a ranch's condition I've seen in my business life. And I've seen a few." He went to bed. Cole and Eliza sat at the table alone in the lamplight. After a while, Cole said, "Walsh?" "I know," she said. "If he makes Walsh a number that sounds better on a Tuesday night than 11 pages of projections." "It won't," she said. Cole looked at her. "You sound sure." "I'm not sure," she said. "But Walsh is selling a short story, and we gave him a long one. Men like Gideon Wilson don't get to where they are by taking the short story." Cole was quiet. He pressed his hand flat on the table, the gesture she had come to understand as his version of deciding something. "If he sells," Cole said quietly, "I won't stay on under Walsh." She had known this already. It didn't make hearing it easier. "I know." "And you? Then I find something else," she said. "That's all. I found things before." He looked at her across the table with an expression that had too many things in it for her to read cleanly. She looked back, and neither of them said what was underneath that exchange, because neither of them was ready to say it, and there was still too much uncertainty in the air around them. Walsh came the next afternoon while Gideon was still out on Agnes. He arrived at the house, and this time Cole met him in the yard, and Eliza watched from the porch. The conversation was short. Walsh produced an envelope. Cole took it and said he'd make sure Mr. Wilson received it. Walsh left. Cole came up the porch steps and held up the envelope. "Want to guess the number?" "No," she said. "It doesn't matter what it is. What matters is whether Gideon has enough context to know what it actually represents." "He does," Cole said. "We gave it to him." She nodded. He stood beside her on the porch, and they both looked out at the yard, the hills, the pale sky with its suggestion of real warmth for the first time since February. The mud in the yard had a different quality to it today, not frozen underneath anymore, genuinely thawed, which meant spring was not a theory, but an actual arriving thing. "The breeding record," Cole said. "What about it?" "Wilson keeps the ranch, regardless of how the partnership goes. Will you stay and do it?" She looked at him. He was looking at the yard, not at her. His profile was very familiar to her now. The line of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, the stillness that was actually a kind of attention. She had been looking at it for 6 weeks and had not noticed, until this moment, how accustomed she had become to it. "Yes," she said, "I'll stay." He nodded. He still wasn't looking at her. "Good," he said. That was all. They stood on the porch for another few minutes in the weakening afternoon sun, and then he went to the barn and she went back inside, and nothing was resolved and nothing was settled, and everything continued to accumulate, quiet and patient, the way a spring snowmelt fills a creek, gradually and then with considerable force. Gideon came back from his ride at 5 in the afternoon. He was quieter than he'd been before he left, with the quality of someone who had been doing something more than riding. He unsaddled Agnes himself, which Cole noticed without saying so. He washed up and came to the kitchen table for supper and ate with the rest of them, Cole and Pete, and Frank, and Eliza, and Reed. And the conversation was not about the ranch. Pete told a story about a horse he'd known in Nevada that had strong opinions about the color red, and Frank contributed a story about a barn cat that had once attacked a county sheriff, and Gideon laughed at both stories with the ease of a man who had temporarily suspended his calculating function. After supper, Reed brought Walsh's envelope to the table. They all looked at it. Gideon picked it up and read it. His expression didn't change. He set it down. He looked at Cole. "He's offering $18,000, he said. The number sat in the room. Pete and Frank both went very still. Cole's expression didn't change at all, which was the thing that told her how hard he was working at not changing it. "Is that fair market?" Gideon said. Cole said carefully, "It's a fair number for what a buyer could see on a quick walkthrough." "And what would someone see on a long walkthrough?" "With the corrected books, the water rights fully documented, the cattle records, and the breeding program if it runs for 5 years?" Cole paused. "Closer to 35. Maybe 40. Gideon nodded slowly. He set Walsh's letter aside. He looked at Eliza's document, which was still on the table where it had been for 2 days, annotated now in 3 different hands. His own pencil markings, Reed's careful notations, and a small addition Cole had written in the margin of page 4 when he'd remembered something about the spring water volume. "Reed," Gideon said. Reed looked up from his notebook. "The partnership structure on page 12, drafted as a legal instrument." The kitchen was very quiet. Reed said, "That's a significant departure from—" "I know what it's a departure from," Gideon said. "Draft it." Reed wrote something in his notebook. Cole sat absolutely still across the table. Eliza kept her eyes on the table, at the edge of Gideon's document, at the careful handwriting she'd produced by lamplight over 3 weeks, at the correction log and the projection tables and the breeding record proposal and 11 pages of work that had been, she now understood, also a kind of argument, not for the ranch's value, but for the possibility of what could be made of it by people who understood what they were looking at. "Mr. Wilson," Cole said. His voice was level. "Thank you." Gideon looked at him. "Don't thank me yet. Reed will have 14 concerns about the legal structure by morning." "I have 11 already," Reed said, still writing. "Then we'll work through all 11, Gideon said. He picked up his coffee cup. "And Miss Mercer will correct whatever numbers we get wrong." She looked up. He was watching her with the expression she'd been trying to read since he arrived. And she understood it now. It was the expression of someone who had encountered something he hadn't expected and was in the process of updating his model of the world to include it. "Yes," she said. "I will." Frank Hurley made a sound at his end of the table that was, unmistakably, satisfaction. Pete nodded at his coffee cup like it had confirmed something. Cole looked at Eliza across the table, just for a moment, and then away. But in that moment there was something neither of them had put words to yet, and both of them knew it, and for now that was enough. More than enough. In a kitchen in Montana in March, with the snow pulling back from the hills, and the creek running again, and the sound of the world beginning, slowly, to open. Reed had 13 concerns by morning. He'd undercounted by 2 the night before. He laid them out at the kitchen table before breakfast was fully on the stove, in the methodical way of a man who had spent 20 years turning other people's intentions into legally defensible instruments. He had a thin voice and a precise manner, and he was, Eliza had decided, not a bad person, just someone who had been trained to find the place where things broke before they broke, which made him exhausting to be around but occasionally useful. Cole sat across from him with his coffee and listened to all 13 concerns without interrupting. Eliza stood at the stove and listened too, turning the skillet handle and making notes on the small pad she kept in her apron pocket, because she had learned in her father's office that the concerns that sounded most procedural were often the ones that hid the real problem. Gideon came in at concern number 7 and poured his own coffee and sat down without being told the context, and picked it up from the middle, which told her something about how his mind worked. The concerns divided into 3 categories, as best she could sort them. The first was legal, questions about what a territorial partnership arrangement could actually enforce versus what it promised, and how that changed if Montana achieved statehood, which was being discussed. The second was financial, how the equity split was structured, and what happened to Gideon's interest if the ranch had a bad year or needed capital investment. The third was personal, and Reed didn't frame it this way, but she heard it underneath, which was that a partnership meant trusting people you'd met 4 days ago with a significant inherited asset. When Reed finished, Cole said, "Which of those 13 can we answer today?" Reed looked slightly caught off guard, like he'd expected either capitulation or argument and gotten neither. The financial structure ones, mostly. The legal questions need a territorial attorney. "There's a good attorney in Helena," Cole said. "A man named Burwell. I've used him for the water rights documentation. He's thorough." "How thorough?" "Thorough enough that when I took him the water rights question, he found 2 issues Pruitt hadn't known about and fixed them both before they became problems." Reed wrote the name down. "I'll wire him today." "Telegraph office is in town," Cole said. "Pete's riding in this morning for supplies. He can take it." Reed nodded, already writing. Eliza flipped the bacon and felt the odd satisfaction of watching a complicated thing begin to move in an organized direction. She had learned, slowly, that most large problems were actually collections of small problems that could be addressed one at a time if you didn't let them overwhelm you all at once. The skill was in sorting them, which was, in the end, not so different from bookkeeping. Gideon looked up from his coffee. "Miss Mercer, the financial structure concerns, walk me through how you'd address them." She turned from the stove. "The equity split is the real issue. 20% to Cole creates a floor but not a ceiling. If the ranch performs the way the projection shows, Cole's 20% becomes considerably more valuable than what it represents today, which is fine for Cole and potentially irritating for your position if you'd expected a fixed arrangement." "Precisely," Reed said, with the tone of a man who appreciates being understood. "The solution is a revenue participation clause alongside the equity," she said. "Cole's 20% represents ownership. Your 80% receives first distribution on net profit up to a defined threshold. Something conservative, say 12% annual return on your valuation. Anything above that threshold is split according to the equity ratio. It protects your position in the early years and rewards Cole's performance in the later ones." The kitchen was quiet. Even the bacon seemed to settle. Reedy looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "That's a fairly sophisticated structure for a ranch kitchen." "It's a fairly standard structure for any business where the capital holder and the operating manager are different people," she said. "My father used something similar when he brought in a junior partner in 1869. The principle is the same." Gideon looked at Reed. Reed looked at his notebook. He wrote something, and then wrote something else, and then looked up. "It would require Burwell to draft the revenue participation language carefully, but structurally, yes. That resolves concerns 4, 7, and 9. "That's 3 of 13, Cole said. "It's a start," Eliza said, and put breakfast on the table. The week that followed was the most complicated of Eliza's time at the Running W, and she had already had several complicated weeks. Gideon and Reed stayed on, Reed waiting for Burwell's wire from Helena, Gideon spending his days differently than she expected. He rode out each morning, sometimes with Cole, sometimes alone, and came back in the late afternoon and sat at the kitchen table with her document and his pencil and asked questions. They were good questions. He had a businessman's mind, and he was applying it to something he hadn't chosen, which meant he was being more careful than he would have been with something he'd pursued. He asked about the cattle market in the nearest rail town. She knew the figures because she'd pulled them from correspondence in Pruitt's files. He asked about neighboring land values. She knew those too. He asked about what the Running W had sold at cattle auction for the previous 2 years, and she showed him in the corrected ledger, and he sat with it for a long time. On the 3rd day, he asked her something she hadn't expected. "What's your stake in this arrangement?" She was at the desk in the study, and he was standing in the doorway, and the question was asked with genuine curiosity and no particular edge. She set her pen down. "My position here," she said. "The work I'm doing." "That's practical," he said. "What's the other reason?" She looked at him steadily. Gideon Wilson was a man who could read a room, she'd concluded. He just did it quietly, without announcing it. "The ranch deserves to be run properly," she said, "and there are people here who've put their lives into it. That matters to me." "People," he said, plural. "Pete and Frank have been here 3 and 5 years respectively," she said evenly. "They're good hands, and this is their livelihood." He tilted his head slightly. He didn't press it. He said, "The 5-year projection, are you confident in it?" "I'm confident in the assumptions. The execution is Cole's department. And if Cole weren't here, if I kept the ranch and partnered with someone else?" She thought about that. "The projection would still be valid," she said carefully. The land is the land. The assumptions about grazing capacity and water and market access don't change based on who's managing. But the probability of reaching the projection in year 2 and 3, instead of year 4 and 5, that's Cole specific. He knows this land in a way that takes years to develop. Gideon nodded. He seemed satisfied with that answer, or at least willing to take it. He went back to the kitchen. That evening, Cole found her on the porch after supper. The April air had a real warmth to it now, the first genuine warmth since she'd arrived, and the light was doing something extraordinary along the western ridge, long and golden and settling into the hills like it was meant to stay. "He asked me today about the land east of the north pasture," Cole said. He stood with his forearms on the porch rail looking out. "What about it?" "Whether it was available. It's not part of the running W. It's been unoccupied since the family that tried to homestead it left in '76. Good land, water access from the same creek system." She looked at him. "He's thinking about buying the adjacent parcel." That's what it sounded like. "That would change the scale of the operation considerably." "Yes." Cole was quiet for a moment. "He asked me if I knew the family that left, whether they'd registered the claim properly." "Had they?" "I think so. I think they filed and then abandoned, which means the land reverted most likely, but the legal status needs to be checked." He paused. "I know a county clerk who would know." She looked out at the ridge. The light was pulling back now, leaving the hills in blue shadow. "He's not thinking about selling," she said. "No," Cole said. "I don't think he is." She felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was held. She kept her expression even. "Then we need to be ready for what comes next. If he commits to the partnership and potentially an adjacent acquisition, the original projection changes, upward, significantly, but so does the management complexity." Cole turned and looked at her. The porch light was behind him, and she couldn't see his expression clearly, just the shape of him and the quality of his attention. "You could do it," he said. "The management side of it." "So could you," she said. "I meant both," he said. "Together." The word together sat between them with a weight that was not entirely about ranch management, and they both knew it, and neither of them moved. "We should write a revised projection," she said finally. "Yeah," he said, "we should." He pushed off the rail and went inside, and she stood on the porch alone for a moment longer and looked at the last light on the hills and thought about the word together and what it meant to her now, 2 months after arriving at a train station with $14 and a one-way ticket that had already been used. She thought it meant more than she was ready to say out loud. Burwell's wire came back from Helena on the 5th day. Reed read it at the breakfast table with his usual contained expression, which meant it could have been good news or a recipe for disaster, and she wouldn't know until he spoke. He read it through twice. He put it down. "Burwell confirms the partnership structure is viable under territorial law," he said. "He has 4 amendments to suggest on the revenue participation language. He's also confirmed that the homestead east of the North Pasture reverted to territorial claim status in 1877, uncontested." Gideon put down his coffee cup. "Is it acquirable?" "Through the Territorial Land Office, yes. It's not fast. The documentation process takes 2 to 3 months minimum, but there's no competing claim." Cole and Eliza exchanged a look across the table. Pete, who had not been in on these conversations, had just come in from the morning feed and was looking around the table trying to piece together the context. Frank was watching Cole's face, which was the most reliable indicator in the room of what something actually meant. Cole's face said, "This is real." "If you're considering the adjacent parcel," Eliza said to Gideon, "the revised projection with that additional acreage looks quite different from the original." "How different?" "I've run the rough numbers. You'd need to see the land first. I haven't been out to the east section. But if the grazing and water access are what Cole describes, you're looking at potentially 60% more carrying capacity for cattle. The breeding record program scales considerably." Gideon was quiet for a moment. He was doing the arithmetic she could see him doing. What does it add to the capital requirement? The land itself, at territorial office rates, is not significant. The development cost, fencing, water management for the additional grazing sections, increased winter feed requirements, that's meaningful. I'd estimate it adds 18 to 24 months to break even on the partnership, but it adds considerably more to the long-term position. Reed looked like a man watching a tennis match from the side and not entirely sure who to root for. "I want to see it," Gideon said. He looked at Cole. "Today." "I can take you out this morning," Cole said. "And you," Gideon said to Eliza, "you should see it too." She looked at him. All right. They rode out after breakfast, the three of them, Cole on Nero, Gideon on Agnes, Eliza on the roan. She'd graduated too from the gray, a horse with strong opinions that she had mostly learned to negotiate. The east section was 40 minutes from the main house, past the north pasture, and through a stand of pine that thinned out into rolling open land that looked to her eye like the north pasture but more so, wider, with a creek line visible at the bottom of a gentle slope and the hills behind it in layers, each one a slightly different shade. She pulled up beside Cole at the rise where the view opened. She could hear the creek from where they sat. "How's the grass?" she said. "It's been resting for 2 years," Cole said. "Should be good. Might need a burn in some sections to clear the old growth." Gideon looked at the whole sweep of it. He sat very still on Agnes the way he had on the ridge above the north pasture, with that quality of letting a thing settle into him before deciding what to do with it. "My uncle never thought to look at this land," he said. "Didn't come up," Cole said. "He should have." Gideon looked at Cole. "You saw it." "I always saw it. Just wasn't my decision to make." Gideon turned that over. He looked at Eliza. "What do you think?" She looked at the land. She thought about what it would mean, the additional accounts, the expanded breeding records, the complexity of managing the water access for 2 separate grazing systems. She thought about what she'd said on the porch to Cole and what he'd said back, and the word together, and the weight of it. "I think it would be a mistake not to," she said. Gideon nodded. He looked at the land for one more long moment, and then he turned Agnes back toward the ranch, and they rode back through the pines with the spring smell of the thaw in everything. What happened next happened in the way of things that have been building a long time, all at once, without warning, and also exactly when it should. The legal documents came back from Burwell a week later, drafted with the 4 amendments Reed had specified. The partnership agreement was 12 pages, precise and clear, and Eliza read it from beginning to end twice before anyone else touched it. She found one error, a transcription mistake in the revenue threshold figure that, left uncorrected, would have disadvantaged Cole by about $400 annually, and noted it on the margin and passed it back to Reed, who corrected it without comment. Gideon and Cole signed it on a Thursday afternoon at the kitchen table, with Pete and Frank as witnesses and Eliza and Reed as the other 2 required signatures. It was not a dramatic moment. Cole signed his name with the same flat economy he did most things, and Gideon signed after him, and Reed blotted the ink and put the document in its folder. Pete shook Cole's hand so hard Cole's shoulder moved. Frank said, "Well, damn," which was the most expressive thing she'd heard him say in 2 months. Gideon poured the whiskey he'd brought from St. Paul and offered a glass to everyone, including Eliza, and she took it, and they drank it standing in the kitchen. It should have been a complete moment, resolved, finished, settled. But Eliza was watching Cole from across the kitchen, and she could see that it wasn't, not quite. I was pleased, and he was relieved, and he was already thinking about spring work, about the south fence, and the cattle movement and the breeding record she'd start in May. But there was something else in his face, something that had not resolved with the signature on the document. She thought she knew what it was. She thought she had known for several weeks what it was. She thought about it that night lying in the room that had been set up for a different bride, listening to the sounds of the ranch in spring, the horses moving in their stalls, the creak of the house adjusting to the warming air, the creak she could now hear from her window running full and clear in the dark. She had been in this room for 2 months. It had been the dead man's spare bedroom and then her room, and now it was simply her room, with her books on the shelf and her account ledger on the desk and her boots beside the door, and she had stopped thinking of it as temporary sometime in the last month without noticing when. She had not gone back to Boston. She had not thought seriously about going back to Boston since the 2nd week. She had told herself this was practical. The work was here, the position was here, and that was true. But it was not the whole truth, and she was too honest with herself to pretend otherwise at midnight. The next morning, Cole was up before her, which was unusual. She found him on the porch with coffee, looking east at the land that was not yet his but was going to be, the adjacent parcel, which Gideon had instructed Reed to begin the territorial land office process for before he left. Reed was leaving today. Gideon was leaving tomorrow. She got her own coffee and came out. The morning was cool and clear, the sky the deep pale blue of early spring, and the light was coming off the hills in that long, quiet way that seemed to belong only to this kind of morning. She stood beside him and did not say anything for a while. He said, "Gideon offered me first right of purchase on his interest, if he ever decides to sell." She turned to look at him. "When did he say that?" "Last night, after the whiskey." A pause. "Wasn't in the document, just said it man to man. Do you trust that?" "I think so. He's that kind of man." Cole turned the coffee cup in his hands. 10 years ago, I came to Montana because I wanted land. My own, not to work someone else's. I remember. You told me. I'm closer to it now than I've ever been. 20% is real. The right of purchase is real." He was quiet. "It just doesn't look like what I thought it would look like when I was 19. She waited. She was good at waiting. "I thought I'd be alone," he said. "When I had it. A man with land. That's the picture I had." He turned and looked at her, and the morning light was full on his face, and she could see everything in it. The 6 years of work, the careful holding of things, and something that had been building since February and had not been spoken yet. The picture changed. She met his eyes. She was aware of the coffee cup in her hands, the cold of the porch rail, the sound of a horse stirring in the barn. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which was behaving unreasonably. "Cole," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what I'm saying." "What are you saying?" He set his coffee cup down on the rail and turned to face her fully. He was not a man who made speeches. She had known that from the beginning. He said things once, directly, and then he waited. "I'm saying that when I rode into that train station in February to pick up a woman who was supposed to marry a man who was already dead, I didn't think I was riding toward anything except a problem to solve. And somewhere in the last 2 months that changed. And I don't want to keep pretending it didn't." She looked at him for a long moment. The morning was very quiet. "I came here to marry a stranger," she said. "I ended up—" She stopped. She started again. "I don't think I expected to feel at home somewhere. I don't think I thought that was available to me." "Does it feel like home?" he said. Careful. Not pushing. She looked at the yard, the hills, the pale sky. She thought about the ledger and the kitchen and the porch and Agnes and the correction log and 17 pages of work by lamplight. She thought about the fall off the horse in the snow and his hand on hers, 1 extra second. She thought about the soup and the laugh she hadn't expected. "Yes," she said. "It does." He reached out and took the coffee cup from her hands and set it on the rail beside his, and then he took her hand carefully, the same way he'd helped her up from the snow. And he said, "Then stay." "I'm already staying," she said. "I mean stay," he said. "Not as the bookkeeper." She understood exactly what he meant. She looked at their hands, his large and worn and very warm, and then she looked at his face and she said, "You're asking me." "Yes." "You're not very good at asking," she said. Something moved across his face that was almost a smile. "No, I'm not." She turned her hand over and held his properly. She felt his fingers close around hers, and the warmth of it moved up her arm. "Then I'll say yes," she said. "So you don't have to ask it any more plainly than that." He exhaled, just slightly, just the smallest release, and she understood how much he had been holding on to, and for how long. They stood on the porch holding hands in the morning light, which was entirely unremarkable, and also the most significant thing that had happened to either of them in years. And neither of them said anything for a while. And that was exactly right. Pete came out of the bunkhouse across the yard and saw them, and turned directly around and went back in, which was so uncharacteristically tactful that Eliza almost laughed. She heard his voice inside saying something short, and Frank's voice responding, and then silence, and she thought that whatever it was Frank had said was probably the most appropriate thing he'd said in months. Gideon Wilson came to find her later that morning. He was packing his bag for the stage tomorrow, and he knocked on the study door and she said, "Come in," and he stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves looking like a man who had spent a week outdoors in Montana and found it stranger and more interesting than expected. "I wanted to say something before I leave," he said. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He looked at the shelves, which had her account books, and Pruitt's old ledgers, and the copy of the partnership document she'd filed in order. "My uncle was not a careful man," he said. "You knew that from the books." "He was a man dealing with illness," she said. "It makes careful men careless." "He was careless before the illness. I knew him." He looked at her. "If he had lived, if you had married him." She thought about it honestly. "I would have made the best of it," she said. "That's what I knew how to do." "That's all you thought you had," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." He nodded. He looked at the shelves again. "This is better," he said simply. She agreed. She didn't say it out loud because it felt too large for the room, too much like something you shouldn't say before it had had time to prove itself true. Gideon left at noon the following day, with Reed and the signed documents and the Territorial Land Office application for the East Parcel. He shook Cole's hand in the yard, and then he turned to Eliza and he said, "The breeding records. I want copies sent to St. Paul at the end of each year." "You'll have them," she said, "and the annual accounts." "Of course." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd finally decoded. It was the expression of someone who had encountered something that revised a prior belief, and who was better for the revision. "It was a good document," he said. "The one you wrote." "We wrote it," she said. He glanced at Cole. He looked back at her. "Yes," he said. "I suppose you did." He got in the hired buggy and Reed got in beside him with his notebook already open, and they went down the road toward Cutbank, and Eliza stood in the yard and watched them go. Cole came to stand beside her. The dust from the buggy wheels settled back onto the road. The afternoon was warm and the hills were showing green at the southern edges where the snow had fully gone. "Burwell's estimate on the land office process," Cole said. 2 to 3 months. That takes us to July. "Yes." He looked at the eastern hills, which were visible from the yard if you looked at the right angle. "Gives us time to get the summer grazing set up properly before we start thinking about the expansion." "I'll start the breeding records in May," she said. "Full format, from this year's spring stock. Pete knows which animals to start with. I'll have him sit with you." She nodded. She thought about the year ahead, the records and the accounts, and the grazing plans and the fence repair, and the East Parcel coming online in July, and the partnership document in its folder on the shelf. She thought about the porch this morning, and the coffee, and the hand, and the word stay. She thought about the woman who had arrived at a train station in February with $14 and a one-way ticket and no plan, and she felt, unexpectedly, that she would like to tell that woman something. She would like to say, "You will be fine." Not because everything works out the way you planned, because it doesn't. But you will be fine. "You're quiet," Cole said. "Thinking," she said. About February," she said. He looked at her. "Long time ago." 2 months, she said. "Feels longer." She thought about that. "Yes," she said, "it does, but not in a bad way." He said nothing, which was his version of agreement, complete and unhurried. They stood in the yard in the April afternoon, two people who had not come here intending to find each other and had found each other anyway, in the middle of a hard winter and a hard situation and a lot of real work, which is usually where the genuine things are found. Not in easy conditions, but in difficult ones, where what remains is what's actually there. Eliza looked at the ranch, the house, the barn, the outbuildings, the hills in their new green, the sky going pale and wide above everything. And she felt the specific weight of a life that had taken a shape she hadn't chosen and had turned out to fit her anyway, better than anything she would have planned. She thought, "This is mine. Not the land, not legally, not yet, but the life in it. The work, and the morning, and the porch, and the man standing beside her with his arms at his sides and his eyes on the horizon. The account books, and the corrected ledger, and the breeding records not yet started, and the 17 pages that had changed everything. She thought, "This is mine." And it was not the careful, contracted thing she had arranged from Boston. It was real and complicated and imperfect, and so much larger than she had thought to ask for. That, she told herself, was the thing about arriving somewhere broken. Sometimes what you find in the wreckage is not what was lost. Sometimes it is something else entirely, something you would never have gone looking for, something that was only reachable because the road you expected had closed and you had to find a different way through. She didn't say any of this to Cole. She didn't need to. She picked up her coffee cup from the porch rail where she'd left it and went inside, and behind her she heard his boots on the steps following, and the door opened and closed, and the afternoon continued, warm and ordinary and full of work, which was exactly as it should be. The breeding records began on the 14th of May, on a morning so clear it made the air look freshly cut, with Pete sitting across the desk from Eliza and a cup of coffee going cold between them because neither of them remembered to drink it. Pete knew the animals the way some men knew cards, not by thinking about them, but by feel, by accumulated attention. He knew which cow had difficult births and which threw strong calves, which bull had passed his temperament to his offspring and which had not, which bloodline ran to size and which ran to endurance. He had never written any of it down because no one had asked him to, and because there had not been a system into which it could be written. Eliza gave him the system, and he gave her 12 years of accumulated knowledge in exchange, and by the end of the first morning, they had the framework for something that would take years to prove its value and was already, clearly, going to be worth the work. "You've been keeping all this in your head," she said, turning back a page to add something she'd missed. "Seemed like the place to keep it," Pete said. "It's a good head," she said, "but heads don't transfer well." He looked at that for a moment. "You mean when I'm gone?" "I mean when you're gone, when Cole's gone, when any of us are gone. The record lives past the person." Pete was quiet for a moment. He looked at the pages she'd filled, the columns, the bloodline notations, the calving dates going back 3 years from memory. "Huh," he said, in the same tone he'd used about her biscuits the first week, which she had come to understand was his highest form of approval. She gave him a copy of the framework to keep in the bunkhouse so he could add notes when he was out with the animals and not near the study. He took it with a care that suggested he understood what it was. Cole came in at noon and looked at the desk covered in breeding notes and said, "How far back did you get?" 3 years with certainty. Pete thinks he can remember 5 years back on the primary breeding pairs, but wants to verify against the old feeding records. Cole nodded. He picked up one of the pages and read it with the concentrated expression he gave to things that mattered. "This is going to be useful," he said. "In about 3 years," she said. "These things take time to prove themselves." "Most things worth having do," he said, and set the page down and went back outside. And Eliza looked after him for a moment and thought that he was right about that in more ways than he was specifically addressing. May moved into June the way spring does in Montana. Not smoothly, but in fits, with cold snaps that reminded you. It was still the mountains and warm days that smelled like the whole world releasing something it had been holding since November. The cattle moved to the summer pasture, and Cole and Frank spent 2 weeks working the fence lines, coming in at dark with the particular exhaustion of men who had been outdoors in altitude all day. Pete managed the daily feeding, and Eliza managed the house and the books and the breeding records and started, in the margins of her own time, a kitchen garden. The garden was Pete's idea, technically. He had mentioned, offhandedly, that the soil behind the house was good. He'd tried to grow something there 2 years ago, but nothing had come of it because nobody followed through. Eliza followed through. She ordered seeds from a catalog in Helena, vegetable seeds, and because she had decided to do the thing properly, 2 varieties of herb and a packet of something flowering that she couldn't entirely justify, except that she'd wanted it. Cole came around the corner of the house one afternoon in early June and found her on her knees in the dirt, which was not where he expected to find her. She had the good black soil on her hands, up to the wrists, and she was setting out seedling rows with a precision that he recognized from her account ledgers. "What is that?" he said. "A garden," she said. He looked at the staked rows, the organized planting pattern, the small labels she'd made from broken wood scraps. "I see that. Why?" "Because we spend a significant portion of the supply budget on vegetables we could grow ourselves," she said, "and because—" She paused. She pressed a seedling into the soil. "And because I wanted to." He stood there for a moment. "You wanted to?" "Yes." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "Is that a sufficient reason?" "It's a fine reason," he said. He crouched down beside her and looked at the rows. "What's this section?" "Carrots. And that's beans, and the back section is squash if the season's long enough, which Pete thinks it will be this year." She pointed. "That's for the kitchen. And that. That's—" She hesitated slightly. "Flowers. I know it's not practical." Cole looked at the small section she'd marked off. He looked at it for a long moment. "My mother grew flowers," he said. He said it simply, without the particular care men used when they were about to explain why something didn't matter. "Out in Oregon. She said the practical things kept you alive and the flowers reminded you why." Eliza looked at him. He was studying the garden rows with the same attention he gave the land, and she thought that this was the thing about Cole Rourke that continued to surprise her. Not what he said, but when he said it, the moments he chose for it. "I like that," she said. She was a smart woman. He stood up. He held out a hand and she took it, and he pulled her to her feet, and he held on for a moment they had grown accustomed to, the small transactions of hands that meant they were in the same place and glad to be. Then he let go and went back to whatever he'd been doing, and she went back to the garden, and the afternoon was entirely ordinary. The letter from Gideon came in late June, with Reed's neat handwriting on the envelope and 2 documents inside. The first was a formal update on the Territorial Land Office process for the East Parcel, which was proceeding and expected to complete by mid-August. The second was a personal note in Gideon's handwriting, which was less neat than Reed's, but easier to read for what it actually said. She read the personal note twice and then took it to find Cole. He was in the barn, which was where he usually was at that hour. She handed him the letter and stood back while he read it. He read it once. He read it again. He looked up. "He's granting us the East Parcel," he said. "A portion of it," she said. "The section adjacent to the North Pasture. He's filing it as part of the partnership agreement. It would be deeded directly to us, not as part of the Running W proper, our own land." Cole looked at the letter. He looked at the barn wall. He looked at the letter again. "That's—" He stopped. "I know," she said. "He didn't have to do that." "No, he wanted to." She paused. "He says in the note, read the 3rd paragraph." Cole found the 3rd paragraph. He read it, and his expression shifted in the particular way of a man encountering something that moves him and is not going to say so directly. He read it again. What Gideon had written in the 3rd paragraph was this: "The operational analysis you both presented demonstrated something I've rarely seen in business. 2 people thinking as one without having arranged to do so. That kind of partnership is not common, and it deserves its own ground to stand on. Consider the east section adjacent to the North Pasture a founding parcel for whatever you build next." Cole set the letter down on the saddle rack. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the barn, the afternoon was doing what Montana afternoons did in June, burning gold in the west and spreading it generously across everything. "Our own ground," he said. "Yes." He looked at her. She looked back. There was a great deal in the look. Everything that had accumulated since February, the long winter, and the work, and the ledger, and the porch, and the mornings, all of it compressed into a moment in a barn with a letter on a saddle rack. "Eliza," he said. "Yes," she said, because she already knew the question and had known it for some time, and she was tired of waiting for it. He almost smiled. "I haven't asked yet." "Then ask." He picked up her hand from her side. He held it the way he'd held it on the porch, carefully, like it mattered. "Marry me," he said. Not a question by its grammar, a statement by conviction. "Yes," she said. "Obviously." He did smile then, the full, unguarded one she'd first heard in the kitchen when she'd made the soup. It lasted about 3 seconds before he contained it, which was all the time it needed. They married in July, on the Saturday before the East Parcel deed came through, which Eliza thought was probably not an accident on Gideon's part, though she never confirmed it. The ceremony was held in the yard of the Running W because there was no other location that felt right. Not the church in Cutbank, which neither of them had any particular connection to, and not indoors because the weather was extraordinary, and it would have been wasteful to ignore it. It was not a large wedding. Cole had no family within 1,000 miles. Eliza's brother Thomas sent a letter that arrived 2 days before, brief, startled, warmer than she expected. And her brother William sent nothing, which was consistent with his character. The people in the yard were Pete and Frank and 2 neighboring ranchers Cole had known for years, a man called Hooper and his wife Clara, who brought a pie and stayed to help set up the tables. The county clerk who had confirmed the land status came, because Cole had asked him and he'd said yes in the spirit of a man who understood he was being included in something he'd been adjacent to. Gideon sent a wire. It said, "Partnership ratified in all its forms." Congratulations to you both. GW. Reed added a postscript in smaller handwriting. The revenue participation language reads correctly. Best regards. Eliza wore the best dress she had, which was a deep blue wool she'd ordered from Helena when she'd ordered the garden seeds, allowing herself both in the same month as a kind of permission to herself that she thought she'd earned. She did her own hair without help, which she'd always done, and she stood in the yard with the hills behind her and the flowers from her garden cut, and in a small bunch she held because Clara Hooper had suggested it, and she thought, this is real. This is actually real. Cole stood across from her and looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Open, uncontained, not the careful stillness he usually maintained. It lasted until he remembered where he was, and then he settled back into himself. But she'd seen it, and she kept it. The vows, they said, were simple. Cole was not a man for ceremony, and she did not need it. They said what was true, that they meant it, that it was real, that they were choosing it, and that was sufficient. Pete cried, which surprised everyone, including Pete, who looked extremely annoyed at himself immediately after and went to get more coffee. Frank shook Cole's hand and then, after a pause, turned to Eliza and shook hers too, with the same firm grip, which was the equivalent of a long speech from Frank Hurley, and she received it as such. After the wedding, there was food on the tables, and the afternoon light did what it had been doing all summer. Generous and long, and flooding the yard in the particular gold that only existed at this latitude in July. Clara Hooper's pie was excellent. Hooper himself talked to Cole for an hour about the East parcel and what Cole was planning to do with it, and Cole explained the expansion plan with a clarity that told Eliza he'd been thinking it through in more detail than he'd mentioned. She didn't mind. She had her own plans she hadn't fully mentioned either. That was the texture of a real partnership. Not two people who told each other everything, but two people who trusted each other enough that the things not yet said were not threats, just work still in progress. The East parcel deed arrived on a Tuesday. They would always afterwards note the Tuesday of it, which had started to feel like the day the important things arrived. Cole spread it on the kitchen table, and they both stood over it and looked at the surveyed dimensions and the official stamps. And Eliza put her finger on the line where both their names were printed, Cole J. Rourke and Eliza M. Rourke. And the feeling that moved through her was not triumph exactly, and not relief, but something quieter and more foundational. A settling. The feeling of a door that had been open closing into its frame, not locked, but resting, solid. Well, Cole said. Yes, she said. He folded it carefully and she put it in the file she'd made for the property documents, and they went back to work, which was the right thing to do. Summer gave way to fall in the way of mountains, abruptly, with conviction. The cattle came back from the summer pasture fat and in good condition, better than the previous years by the measures Eliza had now established for comparison. The breeding records at the end of their first full season were 43 pages, organized by bloodline and calving date and performance metric, and when she sent Gideon's copy to St. Paul, she included a summary note that the first season's data already showed 3 promising breeding pairs that she recommended prioritizing in the spring. Gideon wrote back within 2 weeks, which was faster than she'd expected. He said the records were exactly what he'd hoped for and asked 3 intelligent questions about the methodology. She answered them in detail, and he wrote back again. And a correspondence was established that would continue on a roughly monthly basis for years. Not friendship exactly, not the easy warmth of people who had chosen each other, but something she valued. The steady, professional respect of 2 people who understood what they were each doing and took it seriously. The fall also brought a decision she'd been considering since August. She had been tracking the household supply purchases against what the kitchen garden was producing, and the numbers were clear. The garden had offset a meaningful amount of the supply cost, not transformatively, but genuinely. More interesting to her was a conversation she'd had with Clara Hooper in August, when Clara had stood in the garden and looked at the herb section and asked if she could purchase some of the dried herbs for the winter. Eliza had given them to her, but she thought about it afterward. She talked to Cole about it on a Sunday evening when the fall air had come in through the window and they were both at the kitchen table, him with the grazing rotation plan for next spring, her with a notebook. "The garden," she said. "What about it?" Clara Hooper asked about the herbs. And Mrs. Sutton, when she came by last week, mentioned she'd heard about the squash and asked if we'd have surplus. Cole looked up. "You're thinking about selling from it?" "I'm thinking about expanding it," she said. "Not enormously, But if I doubled the herb section and added 2 more beds of the most requested vegetables, there's a market in Cutbank that gets supply from Helena on the stage, which is expensive and unreliable. A local source that's consistent would be practical, he said. Yes. He looked at her notebook. She turned it so he could see the rough numbers. He looked at them the way he looked at the breeding records, with real attention, not dismissal. What does it need to start? Seed cost is small. Labor is mine. I'm not asking for hired help yet, maybe not ever. The main investment is time, and I have a system for the garden now that's efficient. She paused. I want your opinion, not your permission. He looked at her. The expression he had was the one she had cataloged as, she knows exactly what she's doing, and I am aware of this. My opinion, he said, is that you've thought it through more than you're showing me, and you've already decided. I want to know if you see a problem I don't. He thought about it genuinely, which was the thing she could always count on. He did not give opinions as performance. Cash flow in winter, he said. If you sell fresh in summer and dried in winter, is the winter product substantial enough to… That's the question, she said. I don't know yet. First season will tell. He nodded. Then do it, he said. First season will tell. The garden the following spring was twice the size. By the second summer, she was selling herbs and root vegetables and squash to 3 households in Cutbank and had a standing arrangement with the new cook at the town's small boarding house. It was not a large income, she was clear-eyed about that, but it was hers specifically, distinct from the ranch accounts. And she kept its own ledger with the same precision she kept everything. She had 3 ledgers now. The Running W partnership accounts, the East Parcel development records, and the garden business, which she had named nothing because it did not need a name to be real. The years move the way years do when you are busy with real work. Not fast, not slow, but with the particular texture of time that has substance in it. Cole's 20% equity grew in value as the ranch grew. The breeding records accumulated and proved their worth. By the 3rd year, the Running W cattle were selling at a premium at the rail auction over comparable operations in the county because buyers could see the documentation and the bloodline history and trust what they were getting. Cole attributed this to the cattle. Eliza attributed it to the records. They were both right, which was how it usually was. Pete got a little older and a little slower, but he had become something the ranch had not had before. An institutional memory that could be passed on, because Eliza had spent 3 years helping him write it down. When a young hand named Dolan came on in the 3rd year, Pete sat him down with the breeding records the same way he'd once sat down with Eliza, and Dolan came out of it knowing more in 3 days than Pruitt had probably known in 3 years, and that was the record doing what records do. Frank Hurley, in the 5th year, told Cole he was thinking about moving on. There was land available in Wyoming, and he'd been saving, and he thought the time was right. He told Cole first, which was proper, and then he told Eliza, which he would not have done 2 years earlier and now did without ceremony. She shook his hand and said she was glad for him, and she meant it. He left in April on a horse Cole helped him select, and with a reference letter Eliza wrote, which noted his years of service and his reliability and his particular aptitude with mechanical equipment, none of which was untrue. She watched him ride out and felt the small particular sadness of a person leaving a place they'd built together. She thought about that, how a place gets built. Not in any one moment, but in accumulation. In the daily work, the shared meals, the hands on the same fence rail in the same cold, the coffee and the ledgers and the hay and the arguments about supply orders and the mornings and the nights. In all the ordinary things that, added together, become something that has shape and weight and meaning. She thought about this more as time went on, and the ranch became more clearly what it had always had the potential to be. She thought about it specifically on a morning in the 6th year, when she was standing on the porch, the same porch where she and Cole had stood in April of the 1st year, where everything had still been uncertain, and she was watching 2 children run across the yard. The older one was 4.5, a girl named Ruth, after Cole's mother, who had a strong will in her father's stillness and her mother's habit of counting things under her breath when she was thinking. The younger was 2, a boy named James, after nobody in particular, who had recently discovered that falling down was interesting and kept doing it on purpose to observe the results. He fell down in the yard now and sat in the dirt and looked at his hands, and then looked up at his sister and said something that was not quite a word, and Ruth crouched down and said something back with the gravity of a 4-year-old explaining the world, And Eliza watched this from the porch with her coffee and felt something she had no adequate word for. Not happiness, exactly. Not contentment. Something larger than both, the feeling of a life that had filled out to its actual dimensions, that had found the shape it was supposed to have, even though the shape had been entirely unplannable and arrived through a series of events she had not chosen. Cole came around the corner of the house and stopped when he saw Ruth explaining something to James in the yard. He stood and watched for a moment. Then he came up the porch steps and stood beside Eliza and looked at the children and the yard and the hills beyond. "Ruth told me this morning," he said, "that she wants to know how the account books work." Eliza looked at him. "She's 4. "I know. I told her she could start learning when she was 6. He paused. "She said that was too long." Eliza felt the laugh start somewhere under her ribs. "What did you tell her?" "I told her to go ask you." She shook her head. She looked back at the yard. Ruth had gotten James to his feet and was leading him with complete self-assurance toward the garden fence, which was a boundary she was not supposed to cross without an adult. Eliza made a note to intercept that in about 30 seconds. "Cole," she said. Do you remember when you rode into that train station in February?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "What were you expecting?" He thought about it the real way, not the quick way. "I was expecting a problem," he said. "A woman stuck somewhere she shouldn't be, who needed a solution and then needed to go home. And instead," he looked at her with the expression she knew best, the one that did not perform anything, that had no audience, that was just what it was. "Instead, I got you," he said, "which was considerably more complicated." "Is that a complaint?" she said. "No," he said. He picked up her hand from the porch rail, the same way he always had, with the same care. "It's not." She held his hand and looked at the yard where Ruth had successfully talked James through the gate and was now explaining the garden to him in a tone that sounded remarkably like Eliza's own instruction voice, and she thought, this is what was on the other side of the closed road. This. Not what I planned, not what I could have imagined, this. She had a thought then that she turned over in her mind for a while before deciding it was true enough to keep. The thought was this: most people spend their lives trying to protect the future they imagined, the one they planned, the one they arranged with such care. And sometimes the arrangements hold, but sometimes the road closes. Sometimes the man at the end of the journey is already in the frozen ground, and the station master can't meet your eyes, and you have $14 and nowhere to go. What you do in that moment, not in the dramatic moment, not in the moment of decision, but in the small practical moments after, when you make biscuits and correct the ledger and ask to be taught to saddle a horse, that is what determines the shape of the life you actually live. Not the plan, the response, not the intention, the work. She had not planned any of this. She had planned a practical marriage to a sensible man in Montana territory, a careful arrangement between two adults making reasonable decisions. She had gotten, instead, the whole complicated thing, the cold and the hard work, and the partnership, and the ledgers, and the porch, and the man beside her, and the children in the garden, and the breeding records now in their 6th year, and the flowers that grew every summer because the practical things kept you alive and the flowers reminded you why. She was 35 years old. She had arrived here at 29 with a cardboard trunk and a coat that wasn't hers, and the feeling of a person whose plan had just collapsed into something she could not yet see the shape of. She could see the shape of it now. It was larger than the plan. It was harder than the plan. It was more imperfect and more real and more entirely hers than anything she had arranged. She thought about the woman on that train platform, and she thought, you were not lost. You were in transit. There's a difference, though it doesn't feel like one from the inside. Ruth called from the garden, "Mama!" The word she still found startling in a particular way, because it had not been a word that applied to her until relatively recently, and she was still getting used to the weight of it, which was considerable. "Coming," she called back. She set her coffee cup on the porch rail. She squeezed Cole's hand once and let go. She went down the steps and across the yard toward the garden, toward her daughter standing at the squash beds with both hands on her hips, in an attitude of ownership that she had not been taught and did not need to be, and her son sitting in the dirt again, looking at his hands with great interest. Behind her, she heard Cole's boots on the porch steps, following. Not because he had to, because that was what they did. The Montana sky above was the color it was only in this season, in this light, a blue so deep and clear it looked like it had been washed. The hills were green, the creek was running, the breeding records were on the desk in the study, waiting for the fall data. The ledgers were up to date. This had all begun on a frozen platform with a station master who wouldn't meet her eyes. She was glad now that the road east had been closed. She was glad that $14 wasn't enough to get home on. She was glad she had made biscuits that first morning and asked to see the account books and stayed when the weather broke and the road opened, because staying had been the choice that made all the other choices possible. That is the thing nobody tells you when your plan collapses. That the collapse is sometimes the point. That what falls away was perhaps never the right shape for you anyway. That the frozen platform is not an ending. It is just a place where one thing stops and another, which you could not have imagined and will not be able to plan and will have to build by hand in the cold with whatever you have, begins. Eliza Rourke crouched down beside her son in the dirt of her own garden, on her own land, under her own sky, and looked at whatever it was he was looking at in his hands and said, "What did you find?" He held it up to her. A beetle. Bright green, impossibly small, going about its business with complete indifference to the size of the world around it. She looked at it. She looked at her son's face, the open wonder of it, the 2-year-old certainty that everything found deserves to be shared. "That's a good find," she said. It was. It genuinely was.